Isaiah 53, 8-9. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth.
I mean, he was innocent.
He didn't. It wasn't him. I mean, and that's the thing too. That's how we know they're talking about Jesus,
right?
Because there's nobody else on earth who you could say, did nothing wrong.
Right. And yet he's willing to pay for our transgressions, right? Again, he comes into the situation. He's the arm. He's the arm of God. And what's it say? He's cut off from the land of the living, right? He's literally going to die. He's not just going to die. We understand when you really look at what happened to Jesus on the cross, that he was cut off from God. He didn't just die physically. He was cut off spiritually from God. That's because of how bad sin is, right? That's because of how much the consequences of sin are so extreme. He was cut off, not just from physical life, but from the spiritual life that he had always known. That's what this verse is telling us, and it's amazing that God would be willing to take his own arm, right, and put it in the fire, so to speak, his own arm, and sacrifice it for us. It goes on.
Isaiah 53, 10 and 11. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities.
Wow. And what's happening in this verse, and it's so beautiful, is that we now hear that Jesus is not going to be lost when he is cut off. Like us, when we get cut off from God, when we start going in our own way, we're just going off in our own path. We can't get back. We don't know how to do that straight and narrow line. But Jesus does. Jesus, who is being cut off, he takes all of the pain, all of the sin. He takes the death off of us, and literally the spiritual death. We still die physically, but spiritually, being cut off from God doesn't happen after we've given our life to Jesus. So he takes that death on himself, and yet, because he's God, right? Because he's part of God, right? He can make his way back from such a horrible path.
And what's amazing to me is that, God chose to do it this way. I mean, he chose to make us into beings that are not just like robots. They're beings, we're beings who can make choices, who can choose him or not choose him.
Right.
In order for us to really see what love is, I mean, so in order for that to happen, since we have the opportunity to not choose him, then he had a solution for that, which was that Jesus would then take on our bad choices. Right. The fact that we go away from him so that we could still become a part of him. That's pretty amazing. And
you said it so beautifully too, because we now can be, influenced by what he was willing to do for us. We can have the same mind that he has. And it's interesting. Paul later writes about this, saying we have to have this mind that Christ had, this mind of living sacrificially, of dying for the other person, of living for the other person. Can we read that?
Philippians 2, 5-7. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And it's interesting. He became like us, just like we were talking before about we were made into the likeness of God.
Right.
And so now, in order to save us, he had to come into human likeness.
Yes, it's beautiful. We'll later do a dialogue about that, about him being the Son of God and the Son of Man, because he takes on both some of the nature of God. I mean, he is God, right? He's taking on the nature of man and blending those two natures. And what he's doing is in that he's showing us that we, from where we are, because he can come to us, we, from where we are, can get back to him. He can take on and bear our iniquities and our problems. And he, in that same way, he makes it possible for us to get to where he is. Let's read more about that.
Philippians 2, 8 through 9. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name. So he is back.
That's right. He's back. Isn't it beautiful? He goes into a situation where he comes into our world, right? And as a man, he dies for us. But God resurrects him. God brings him because he's willing to do that. God brings him back into a relationship with him. And we learn, he says, that we need to take up our cross, right? We need to take up our cross and follow him. We need to live like him in the way that, we're not going to be able to pay for anybody else's sin, but we're able to live our lives sacrificially, loving other people, finding out that it's not about just us, but caring for others is actually the way God wanted it from the very beginning. Remember, we talked about he wanted us to love God with all our heart, with all our mind, with all our soul, with all our strength. But then he also wanted us to love our neighbor, right, as ourselves. And so we have this amazing chance now to see what love is, real love is. And this is what, we struggle with it because he paid our sin debt. He died for us. But the story didn't end there. Let's read in Romans.
Romans 8, 31 to 34. What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Who will bring any charge against those whom God has chosen? It is God who justifies. Who then is the one who condemns? No one. Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding for us.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah. Just like you said before, he's back. He's the arm of the Lord that was cut off from God, who has now become back to the right hand. He's been returned back to the right hand, to that hand that does the work, that the king, that the one who's in charge. The arm is the right hand is symbolic for that source of power that king has. They use that person who's their right hand to execute the orders to do the work that they want done. So he is back, and it's hard for us. What's left is for us to get this understanding into our hearts, to understand his love, what he did, who he is. It's hard, but we have to find a way to open our hearts to really understand the situation that humanity is in and the reason that God did that, the reason that God did a solution that required, suffering and dying on the cross. A love like that was involved so that we could learn something deeper, something that we never could learn any other way. That's what it talks about in Ephesians, if you could read that.
Ephesians 1, 18 through 20. I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in his holy people, and his incomparably great power for us who believe. That power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly realms.
That right hand, again, we know that he is there and he's in that right hand. But we also know that it's on us to understand what's going on. this is what's so amazing about this is this hope that even though we know we're not perfect, we know that to be a human being, people say, oh, he's only human, right? People know that to be a human being means to be a person who does all kinds of stuff that's not right. I mean, you do some things that are right, but you do things that aren't right too. Everybody does. And yet, from before Christ and after Christ, there are people who have hope that God can solve that problem. They have hope that God can find a way, even with, us as we're like broken, we just don't work right. We don't do right. But how is it that God can still save us and redeem us if we're so broken? The reality is we don't necessarily need to know the whole story. We just need to believe that he can. And this is what people in the Old Testament, they have
because I was wondering about that because they didn't have Jesus yet.
Right. They didn't know who Jesus was yet, and they didn't know how he was going to save them. Yeah. They knew God was going to do it, but they didn't know how. That's what's so beautiful about what Job says. Let's read Job's testimony.
Job 19:25-27. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth, and after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. What's interesting in that is that I'm actually playing that song. I'm practicing to play that song. I Know My Redeemer Lives by Nicole C. Mullen. So that's just a beautiful song.
I can't wait to hear it. I know anytime you play that song, anybody who hears that song,
I don't know about my playing of it, but it's a great song.
It moves you. It makes you feel what Job is feeling, right? Is that there is hope, even though you don't necessarily know, like Job didn't know. How is he going to do this? How is my Redeemer going to do this? Job is saying in that passage, at the end of my life, he's saying his skin is going to be destroyed. Everything's going to be destroyed. Yet still God's going to be able to bring him back to life. He's saying that he will be able to see God in his flesh even after it's destroyed, right? So he's talking about a kind of resurrection that he knows somehow God has a plan that can take Job from the situation he's in. And he's in a bad situation. In that particular time, he's going through an illness and he's lost everything. But he knows it's more than just that. He also knows that he's got a sin problem, just like everybody else. People read that book and sometimes think, well, Job is saying he hasn't sinned. Well, he's saying he hasn't been like other people who have sinned and didn't honor God. But he's not saying he doesn't still have the same issue as being a regular human being. That's what we need to understand. Job is just like the rest of us. Let's read in chapter 16 what he says.
Job 16:19-21. Even now my witness is in heaven. My advocate is on high. My intercessor is my friend. As my eyes pour out tears to God, on behalf of a man, he pleads with God as one pleads for a friend.
That's wonderful to hear, right? And Job is making it clear again, this Redeemer, this intercessor, right? This person who he knows must be there. This person is pleading his case because literally before God, it's almost like a trial here, but he literally knows that he's done wrong, that he needs somebody to plead his case. And literally his Redeemer is pleading in behalf of a sinner, of a person who's done wrong. And yet, that's the kind of person Jesus is. He comes and he does, but he does more. He does more than Job could imagine. He doesn't just plead our case. Literally, he takes the guilt from us. He's like the arm that, we know God doesn't have a physical body. God is in a spiritual realm. We know this is all metaphors. But it's the metaphor of he's a part of God. And he allowed himself to be cut off from that. He allowed that part to be literally severed so that it could be used to save us, to rescue us from whatever we're headed towards, and instead to take that on itself. When God can't be associated with sin, this part was offered up as a sin offering, to be associated with the sin, the evil. He never did any evil, but he allowed the debt or the effect of the evil to hit him instead of the rest of us, so that we aren't cut off, that we aren't destroyed so that we can still have spiritual connection with God. He gave up his so that we would have ours. And yet, Job didn't know all of this was going on, right? Job was just like, he'll just plead my case. But he did more than that. He didn't just plead his case. He stepped in front of a bullet that was headed Job's way, right? I mean, that's who Jesus is.
Yeah.
And yet people don't understand that that's what the Bible is saying. It's not saying that people are able to be good.
And that's why, what keeps on coming to my mind is the verse that says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us.
That's
it had to be because there's no other state for us to be until Christ died for us.
Until Christ came.
We are sinners.
We are sinners.
So, it certainly wasn't that we were good, and
That's
then
right.
he died for us because we were good.
Yeah, and I like to think it was like there's a 2-part stage, just like there's a plan or a part 1 where we're in the darkness, and there's a part 2 when we come into the light.
Yeah.
But there's also a part 1 where Jesus dies for our sin. He takes on the literal the consequences of our sin. But then there's a part 2 where he does something miraculous and gets us into a relationship with God that can't be broken. A relationship with God that is eternal. And this is something beautiful because this is where we can now start talking about what we have to do to walk in that relationship. It's a relationship. It's not about, just religion. There's lots of religions, but we're talking about a relationship, a particular relationship that is available to us, that is available because of what Jesus did on the cross, because he paid that sin debt. There's a relationship we can now have. And we have to say yes to that relationship, right?
And we're going to talk about that more in the next episode.
We'll talk about that in the next episode. And this time I think we'll really be able to do it in the next episode because now we've laid the groundwork. Okay. I think we're ready to do it. Okay. And I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too.
And I hope they're looking forward to it too.
Yeah.
So this is our invitation to you to join us for the Logos Dialogues.